morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today, we are presenting webinar on communication through storytelling, organized by Applied Science and Humanities Department of Parul Polytechnic Institute, Parul University. The main agenda of this webinar is how to tell the right story at the right time, which creates stronger connections between people at work and at home. It's a powerful means of communicating and engaging any audience. Here, we will learn why storytelling works and some tips to make sure the stories we share are creating connection and value. I, Vaishali Nathwani, would like to introduce today's guest speaker, Sarah Elkins from Helena, Montana, USA. She is a public speaker, Gallup certified strength coach, communication coach, author, and podcast host. She loves to guide individuals and teams to improve communication using storytelling as a foundation of her work. She is a Gallup certified strength coach and uses that tool to coach groups of people to improve their communication in all relationships and to find more satisfaction at work and at home. Her expertise in training and facilitating comes from a variety of experiences in the public sector. Her book, Your Stories Don't Define You, How to Tell Them Will, is now available on Amazon.com. She believes in being human in all her faults and beauty in every environment. According to her, each of us has our own story, which helps to work with people to improve day-to-day interactions. It's our privilege to welcome you, ma'am, and you can start with the session.
Thank you so much. This is my pleasure, and something I haven't done before, guest lectured in India from Montana. So welcome to 2020.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I put together some basic slides so that people could go along with me in my notes. Many years ago, when I was in high school, this was my first car. Yes, it was a gold 1974 Super Beetle, VW Super Beetle. And my parents wouldn't let me take it from the garage to school until I could demonstrate that I could change a tire on that car and change the oil. I have many stories of my times in that car, but one of my favorites was when I was a sophomore in college at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, and I got a job as the office manager of a small garage called Import Tech, where the man worked almost exclusively on imported vehicles. I asked him if he would train me, teach me how to work on my car during times when I wasn't too busy in the office, and he agreed. And I have this vivid memory of coming back home where I was living with 3 other women in a house, and I had my professional clothing on, nice slacks and a nice top, and I had grease all the way up to my elbows. I got as much of it off as I could when I was at work, but I couldn't get the rest of it off. And I remember the 3 girls that I lived with being shocked and saying, "What are you doing?" But I loved it. I loved learning how to work on my car. I loved being able to bleed the brakes, and I changed the whole pedal assembly into something new. And when there was a problem, I could fix it myself. I have so many wonderful memories of people helping me when I would get stranded, because when you drive a VW Bug, especially the old style, you get stranded sometimes. Anyway, that's the beginning of my story. So why do we share stories? Well, first of all, it helps you connect with an audience with emotion and vulnerability. By sharing that story, I was telling you something about myself. And I'll get into more detail about why that works in a little bit. Also, really important when we share stories, it gives us an opportunity to think about the event or the incident or the situation in a different way. When we tell a story, it can change our internal messages and it can change how we see ourselves. it also can change how somebody else perceives us. And in the case of building your personal brand or communicating your value, being able to share a good story gives you the opportunity to demonstrate your skills and your values, which would be called your personal brand, which also sometimes is interchangeable with your reputation. So it used to be, back 30 years ago, that a company could define the brand of their work. They could define it themselves. When I was in college and we talked about marketing, we talked a lot about building a brand, and that included your logo, the colors that you used, the words that you chose to use, all of the external trappings of your organization and your products and your services. But in the last 20 years, thanks to the internet, we don't get to define our own brand anymore. So when you look at this picture and you think of McDonald's, 30 years ago, they could tell you that they had healthy food, and you didn't have access to as much information to find out that that wasn't necessarily the case. Now, of course, we can see videos, YouTube videos of how McDonald's food is made, the chemicals they add to the French fries, to the oil in the French fries, how they squeeze this pink goo out of a machine to end up being chicken McNuggets. You have access to this now, so they can't define their brand themselves. Now, a brand is defined by how the stakeholders view it, the majority of your stakeholders. I don't know much about the restaurant's logo on the bottom, but you probably do. So in a little while, I'm going to ask you to think about what their brand is and whether it actually is in alignment with what they want it to be. So your personal brand is very similar. Your personal brand is how the majority of the people in your life perceive you. So as you can see, I found a couple of famous Indians that I thought I would put them up here because you probably have a very specific idea of what their brand is. Clearly, on the top left, you're talking about an athlete, and on the bottom right, a Bollywood actress. But when you think about the words that they would use or that you would use to define them, kind, smart, generous, I don't know. But those are the words that you would use to describe them in terms of their brand. Tiger Woods used to have a wonderful brand. And then, of course, he really did some damage to it because his behavior didn't align with how he wanted to be perceived. And I don't know if you're familiar with Kim Kardashian up in the top right, but her brand is not very positive, but I think she likes it because she gets a lot of attention because of it. So it's not just about how you want to be perceived in terms of the words you want people to use, but it's also what is your intention when you're behaving in a certain way. So when you talk about your personal brand, you need to consider your values. What's important to you? You need to think about how you demonstrate those values. What do you do that makes it clear that those are your values? And think about how people perceive you based on those actions, those behaviors, the words you choose to use. That's your personal brand. So let's start with a quick exercise. Hopefully you have a piece of paper next to you or open up a note option in your phone and think about 3 words you would want people to use after an interaction with you. I'll give you some examples. Competent, funny, compassionate, curious, smart, knowledgeable. I'm going to give you a few seconds to just jot down the first 3 words that come to your mind about how you want to be perceived. Sometimes people think there's a difference between how they want to be perceived at work and at home, but that's not the case. You are the same person. You bring the same values, no matter where you're sitting or standing or walking. So it's really important that you let these 3 words come to your head and try not to think too much about it. And in the chat box, if you feel like sharing your 3 words or one of your 3 words, please feel free to do that. I'll be looking at the chat box at the end of this presentation so we can go back through and review some of your answers. Hopefully you've managed to come up with 3 words. And if one of our hosts could read the chat box, if you see it come up, that would be great. Did anyone answer that question? I'll just move on and we'll see them at the end.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah?
The 3 words.
3 words?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The 3 words are kind, funny, and smart. That has been given by Hamel, sir.
Mm-hmm. Smart, funny, kind. Those are wonderful words. Think about how you would demonstrate those words. Are there any others?
Not, ma'am, not till now.
Okay. Hopefully
I will let
people
you
will
know,
add
ma'am.
them.
Yes, I will
Thank
let you know. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's get into the meaty part of your values. And that's how you make sure that what you're doing, what you're saying, the relationships you're building demonstrate those values so that you're in what I call alignment. So what can you do and say consistently to demonstrate that you are those words, smart, funny, kind? One of the things that is really wonderful about being able to tell a story is that if you have to tell somebody you're smart, you're probably not doing it right. If you can tell a story that demonstrates your intelligence, then people will believe you. So for instance, I could tell you I'm a really good cook, but you'd have no reason to believe me. But if I tell you a story about the beautiful homemade pizza I made a few weeks ago when my mother came to visit, you might believe me when I describe how long it took me to really figure out how to make the perfect pizza crust, because I'm at high altitude. We're at just over 4,000 feet. And so yeast breads are harder to rise. I can tell you that when I made the first pizza that night, I made about 6 of them. The first pizza I made, when my husband put it in our wood-burning pizza oven, he turned it a few times and it cooked in 5 minutes. It came out and the edges were bubbled and just barely browned. The bottom was nice and crisp. And the topping was a browned butter with bits of sage and a little bit of red onion on top. And when you bit into it, it was so delicious. You could feel the texture of the crumbly on the edges, but the elasticy feel as you put your teeth into that pizza. So now I've described that I'm a good cook. And you're probably hungry now. I know it's in the morning for you. Hopefully you'll have lunch sometime soon. But rather than saying I'm a very good cook, I like to tell a story to demonstrate it. So think about what you can do to consistently demonstrate what you want people to know about you. The thing about it is that if you want to be known as generous, but you never have time for people when they need you, you're not going to be known as generous. If you want to be known as compassionate, but you're not really a good listener, you're not going to be known as compassionate. You do have some influence on how people perceive you, and it's all based on your behavior, your actions, and the stories that you tell. So let's get into some of the storytelling components. I always tell people that the most important aspect of being a good storyteller is observation of your audience. That means listening, and not just with your ears for sounds, but listening with your eyes. Actively listening to watch people's body language, watch how they're looking at you, the expressions on their faces. Because when you really observe your audience, you know whether your story is going to have impact. You know whether you're connecting on a deeper level. And when you hit a nerve where you notice somebody crossing their arms and leaning back, then you know that you said something that might have been offensive to them. It gives you a wonderful opportunity to stop and either ask them or switch directions in your story. So observation, being a good listener, and that means listening to things that aren't being said. Being a good listener and observing your audience is really the key to being a great storyteller. Your facial expressions have to match the story you're telling. So if you're telling a story about your child that makes you laugh and smile, but you tell it with a very straight face, it's not going to be in alignment. People won't understand what you're trying to say to them. Body language. If you are telling a story and the people around you have their arms crossed, you might not be connecting with them in the way that you want to. And if you're telling a story with your arms crossed, I promise people won't listen in the same way they would if your body language was open, if your arms are out to your sides, and you're making good eye contact. I know in some cultures, eye contact isn't polite. Make sure, again, go back to observing your audience. Know who you're talking to and whether eye contact is something that's important in that culture. Think about the image that you want to present to the world. I'm not talking about really being all about style, spending a lot of money on clothes and makeup and hair. I'm talking about being intentional about how people are perceiving you. If I want to be known as a professional and I walk around in pajama bottoms and slippers, I'm not going to be known as a professional. If I want to be known as somebody who understands the context of wherever I am, then I have to dress appropriately for wherever I'm going. It's about being intentional. So for instance, if I'm going to talk to Montana ranchers, the people across the state that raise cattle or sheep, I'm not going to wear 4-inch high heels and a business suit. I'm much more likely to wear cowboy boots and jeans. But if I'm flying to Washington, D.C. to give a presentation, and it's going to be full of professionals, I'm going to dress the part. Your image really has to be considered in terms of how you want to be perceived. Again, you have some influence. And you don't have to care what everyone thinks of you, but you do need to care about what certain people think of you, because those are the people that are going to advocate for you and help you and support you when you're ready to take any future steps. Content. Of course, every story has to have content. It helps if it has a little bit of humor. It helps if there's something that might connect on an emotional level. I love to tell the story of when I had my first son and I was holding him very carefully on my lap, and I called my mother, and I just started crying. As I was looking down at this beautiful baby boy, I just started crying on the phone with my mother. And she was so worried. She said, "Sarah, what's going on? I just want to know you're okay." And I said, "I'm okay." And then with broken breath, because my tears were coming so hard, I said, "It's just that now I know how much you love me." Anyone who loves somebody can relate to that story. And when I tell it as a longer story, I can add all kinds of humor and details that will help that story resonate with my listeners, regardless of whether you have children. And the environment is also part of your storytelling component. Being aware of how you're telling a story and where you are when you're telling that story is part of making it an impactful story. So let's talk about that. I told you the story of my pizza. Now think about how you can demonstrate your skills through the stories that you tell. I can tell stories about work projects that I did, and I would be very, very specific with that. Every story I tell gives you a different glimpse into the complexity of who I am. And that's part of what makes this such a great tool. You don't want to be known as just Professor so-and-so. You want people to know that you are human, that you can connect with them on a deeper level. So if I tell a story about backpacking through the wilderness and camping and fishing, you're going to see that side of me. And then if I tell you a story about my relationship with my mother, the picture on the left, It will give you another side of me, like when I told the story about when my son was born. And then if I tell you a story about a performance that I did when I was singing with a band, that's the middle picture. It's going to give you a completely different perspective of who I am. The more people understand how complex you are, the more likely it is that they're not going to see you as just one type of thing or person. My friend calls it freezing people in time. When you learn one thing about somebody and you choose that one thing to represent everything about that person. If you're telling stories that represent different aspects of your life, you are less likely to be frozen in time. So think about this. The way that you are perceived also has an impact on the people that you represent. I tell people you are an ambassador for your people. At any given time, I represent women, I represent mothers, I represent Jewish people, I represent Americans. At any given time, my behavior can have an impact on the way people perceive other people that are like me. So it's important to consider that you are representing every different kind of person depending on who your audience is. So think very carefully about how you want to be perceived. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to be a great ambassador for yourself and for others. And be consistent in your actions and behaviors to demonstrate your personal brand. Make sure that when you are consistently behaving in that way, that they represent the values of you and your organization. One thing people seem to miss when it comes to telling stories, I can tell you many of my coaching clients have said, I don't really have any stories. But that's just not true. Everyone has stories. The question is how you find them. And truly, your stories don't have to be epic. They have to be meaningful. What I find is that when people tell stories with names of celebrities and famous people, they aren't connecting with their audience in the same way. It can be entertaining and fun, and absolutely there's a place for them. But really, when you want to connect with somebody and really make a relationship with them, where you share a story that generates a memory in the listener's mind, and then they want to share a related story, that's what connects you. And every time I tell the story about looking down at my son and realizing how much my mother loved me in that moment, every time I tell that story, people connect with me on a different level. It's not an epic story, but it's meaningful. So how do you find those meaningful stories? First thing that I do is I think about things that happened to me during my days or weeks that I found really satisfying. Sometimes I keep a journal and I write down those satisfying moments so that I can come back to them and think about what the story is behind them. One of my very satisfying moments was just last week when we're having a big project done at our house in our kitchen. And I was talking to the electrician who had just recently moved to the city from a reservation of American Indians. It's called the Salish Kootenai Indian Reservation. And he was telling me that he actually had a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology and then went back to school to become an engineer or an electrician. And just learning that about him, getting to know the complexity of him, finding out about his daughters and his relationships, that I found very, very satisfying. And it could make a good story. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'd love for you to get involved. So I have my chat box open. And I'd love for you to let me know some of your words. And then we can talk through maybe what your behaviors are that could demonstrate those words. Or your skills. Any volunteers?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, the students cannot share in the chat box. We are the moderators
Oh,
to communicate with you. So, some of the students and faculties have shared their words through WhatsApp with us. So,
okay.
one of them have shared the three words: passionate, reliable, and well connected.
Oh, wonderful. So is that person still online? When she says well connected or he says well connected, can that person tell me what they do to demonstrate that they're well connected?
Ma'am, he can't be with us on online. They have the
Okay.
another link for it. Yes, this is the link for only four of us. He can't
Okay.
reply on this thing.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, I'll give some examples.
Yes,
When you
yes,
say
ma'am.
well connected, I think probably the best way to demonstrate that is that when somebody needs something, you're the person that says, oh, I know just who to introduce you to. But how do you develop those relationships so that you are considered well connected? You have to do that with warmth, but you also have to ask all the right questions. So to be well connected, you have to be a good question asker. Do you agree?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yes, thank you. So well connected. Were there any other comments that you saw?
Yes, ma'am. The second one was knowledge, funny, and smart.
Knowledgeable, funny, and smart. I love when people say funny. I have to tell a funny story about that. When I was doing a keynote presentation, there were about 300 people in the room. This was late last year. And I was asking that question of the audience, can you tell me some of those words that you would write down? And there was a woman in the very back of the room, and her arms were crossed in front of her like this. And she was leaning back from the table, and she yelled out, friendly, just like that. I thought that was one of the funniest things I had seen. And of course, the audience all kind of chuckled because they thought that that was pretty funny. It's hard to be known as friendly when you yell in that tone and have your arms crossed in front of your body.
Yes,
So funny is a good one. Anything else
yes.
come through?
The third one is from one of our faculty responded, kind, generous, and thoughtful.
Oh, and do you know this faculty member?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me a story that demonstrates one of those qualities
Right now, I can't
about him?
communicate with her. She is a female faculty, and she is working in another department. I can't communicate with her right now, but she shared with me the three words that is kind, generous, and thoughtful.
Mm-hmm. So then, what I like to do sometimes when I'm not sure that I'm demonstrating the words that I want people to use, I'll actually ask people. So, one of the words that one of my friends used that she asked, she said that she wanted to be known as considerate. And I was able to tell her a story about how she was demonstrating being considerate. So, the story was when we were walking together and her dog had to do his business on somebody's yard, she picked it up. Of course, she got her bag and she picked it up because that's what a considerate person does. So anytime you think about wanting to be known as being considerate, even if nobody's looking, you have to do those things. Because if you're not doing it, so for instance, if she only picked it up because I was there, but she didn't pick it up the next time it happened, then she would know even if nobody else knew. And when you're out of alignment, people notice. It just doesn't feel right.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So I went through these slides a little bit too fast today. Normally, it takes me a good 50 minutes to get through them. So I'm going to back up to the stories that we tell and the impact on perception. So I briefly mentioned that we don't have to care what people think. And that's something that I ask during my workshops. Do you have to care what people think? Do you care about what people think? And most of the time people say no, they don't care what people think. But there's a consequence to that. So for instance, I was working with a coaching client. I'm going to say her name was Lacey. And she was known in her circle of colleagues where she worked as being kind of a bully and aggressive. And I asked her for her 3 words. Her words were a leader, smart, and knowledgeable. So those were 2 different things for her, smart and knowledgeable. So what was interesting about that was when I asked her, I said, well, do you think people use those words to describe you? She said, I don't care what people think. But the reality is that if she doesn't care what people think and she wants to be a good leader and people know her as being a bully or aggressive, then people aren't going to follow her willingly. So I asked her that question. When you have a boss that's not particularly nice or you feel like they're bullying you, do you bring your best efforts to work? And she said, well, I'm a hard worker no matter who my boss is. I said, well, yes, but are you bringing your best? Because when we're at work and we aren't feeling valued or we're feeling bullied, we can't bring our best. Our brain doesn't work that way. So it's really important to take steps to make sure that if you want to be a leader, you are demonstrating those values of leadership, good leadership, because you want to be an effective leader. So sometimes you have to care what people think. Any questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
1 second.
Okay.
The first question is, how storytelling affects the brain?
How storytelling affects the brain. Well, I am not a neuroscientist, but I can tell you that I just read an article by Melissa Hughes, who studies neuroscience. And she said that when you hear a story well told, the same parts of your brain activate as the person who's telling the story, as if you are living it and remembering it. We also know that our brain memorizes or learns things better when the data is accompanied with a story. One of my favorite books is called Happy Hour with Einstein by my friend Melissa Hughes. And she talked about when you use multiple parts of your brain at the same time, you create much stronger neural pathways. So what a story does when you're hearing a story or reading a story is it activates lots of different parts of your brain and creates positive neural pathways. So when you want to apply this to improving your own confidence and addressing issues with your own communication, think about how you're telling a story. So for instance, you all know somebody who complains all the time. You know somebody who always says things like, oh, everything bad happens to me. Well, we know that when we talk like that, that is exactly what happens because that's what you're seeing. And what you fixate on, what you're looking for, is what you're going to find. So if you're looking for all the bad things that are happening to you, you're going to find them. So what if we address the way that we tell a story rather than complaining? For instance, when somebody wakes up in the morning to their washing machine leaking all over the floor, they could easily tell the story about how they walked out of their bedroom and they had their socks on and they walked into a puddle of water and how frustrating it was. And you can start with that part of the story. But if you want to shift it for yourself and for the people listening to it, you can talk about how you resolved the issue. Rather than continuing to complain about everything went wrong, talk about how you happen to have some towels right there handy because you had just started some laundry. Or you could talk about how you were able to resolve it by calling somebody that came to fix it right away, or talk about the solution to the problem rather than fixating on the angry part or the frustrated part of the story. When you have something that you've been through, something difficult that you've been through, if you can focus about 10% of your story on the challenge itself, and then the other 90% of the story is how you were resilient, how you were persistent in addressing that challenge, that's what people will be inspired by, and that's what makes your brain light up, that inspiration.
Yes, that's true, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
The second question from one of our students is, how can we use storytelling in marketing?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, of course. My specialty is more about storytelling for connection as individuals and in teams or as public speakers. I can tell you that storytelling is used in marketing all the time. When you watch I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's Subaru in the United States is an all-wheel drive vehicle. And around here in Montana, you see Subarus everywhere. Well, the advertisement that you see on TV or on YouTube is all about, they call it Subaru Love. And when you watch their images across the screen, my favorite one is when you see a young boy getting into a car seat with a puppy on his lap. And then every image after that is the boy growing up and the puppy getting older with him. And at the end, he upgrades into a bigger Subaru because the dog is so big. So that's a marketing story using storytelling. They don't even need to use words. It's all in images. So absolutely. And I encourage you to think about your individual stories in terms of marketing. Because when you know your own values and you can share them through a story, you are going to encourage people to help you reach your goals. That's just how it works. It's inspiring to hear your personal stories. So as much as marketing uses storytelling, I think it's just as important for you to recognize your own personal stories and their impact on you.
Okay. Third one is, can you share, ma'am, some storytelling techniques with us so that that would help students?
Yes, of course. And what?
That will be helpful to students and faculties for communication.
Okay. Well, let's start by finding a story that you want to share. When you think about something that will resonate with your audience, so remember I mentioned observation being the key. Being a good listener is the key to being a good storyteller. Yes. So if you start off with recognizing your audience, so for instance, if you're speaking at if you're speaking as a lecturer and you're talking to your students and you really want them to understand why you're teaching, because that will connect them with what you're teaching as well. So think about a story from your youth that encouraged you or inspired you to go into the area of expertise that you have. And students can do this too. Think about something specific that happened to inspire you to do what you're doing now, even if it's going to school, even if it's volunteering somewhere to help homeless people or animals. So in my case, I think in terms of pivotal times in my life. So for instance, about 5 or 6 years ago is when I started really focusing on storytelling as a coaching tool. Before that, I was really all about customer service and customer experience. But what was interesting is that I always used storytelling as lessons in customer service and customer experience so that people could really remember and understand how to offer great customer service and how to be a good customer. Well, the reason I say it was about 5 or 6 years ago is because I had been writing blog posts about customer service and customer experiences. And I got a call from a woman from the International Tour Management Institute, ITMI. they were having their annual symposium coming up in that January, and she asked me if I would be interested in being one of their speakers. So, of course, I said, yes, I would love to submit a proposal to be one of your speakers. What would you like me to talk about? Customer service? She said, no, storytelling. And I remember hesitating for just a moment and then saying, yes, of course. Yep, I can submit that proposal. I remember hanging up the phone and having a total moment of panic because I had never done anything like that before. But that moment was pivotal for me. And I didn't know it at the time. I just said yes because I wanted to do it. But it wasn't until probably 2 years later that I could look back at that moment and realize that that changed everything in how I do my work as a coach, and how I help people become better public speakers, and how I help teams improve their communication. That was the moment that storytelling became the primary foundation of my work. So think about a pivotal moment as a teacher or as a student that really stands out as a time or a conversation that changed the way you see yourself or changed the way that you see your place in the world or your relationships with people. So one way to do that is to think in terms of your relationships. One person who inspired me in a very big way was my father. So I can tell a specific story about a conversation I had with my father that inspired me to do something important, to do something that would shift my trajectory in life and my career. Those are the stories you're looking for. When you're observing people, here's another important aspect of storytelling. When you're observing somebody and you notice that they are turning away from you, you notice their feet are starting to move in a different direction, they're stepping back, maybe they're crossing their arms. Knowing when to end your story is just as important as knowing which story to share. When you see that, you can actually back off and you can say, oh, I can see that you're in a hurry. We can finish this conversation later. Or, oh, I'm sorry, I got so excited about sharing my story that I wasn't paying attention to what you need. What can I do for you? Or, how are you? Being able to switch that gear quickly when you notice is probably one of the other important aspects of people who overshare, or everybody knows somebody that they don't want to run into because the person talks too much and they don't know how to pull themselves away from a conversation. That person needs to start observing better and being able to take that step back. I could go on this unless there are other questions.
Okay. Okay, ma'am. The next question is, does storytelling is a powerful way of conveying emotions?
Yes, storytelling is a great way to convey emotions, especially when you're talking about somebody that you care about and talking to somebody that you care about. I find that some people are really uncomfortable, especially at work, but they're really uncomfortable with the emotions of another person. So instead of really dropping an emotion onto somebody that obviously isn't there for that kind of conversation, it might help to be able to just share a story that tells somebody how you're feeling rather than saying, I'm feeling really sad. Tell a story about what's making you sad. Because when you can do that, the other person is a lot more likely to be able to relate to it, and you're giving them something to feed on. So one of the most beautiful aspects of sharing the right story at the right time is how it triggers the memories of the person in front of you. So if you want them to demonstrate emotion, if you want them to demonstrate some minor level of vulnerability, obviously it's not a counseling session. You don't want them to suddenly blurb everything out that is making them sad or uncomfortable. But if you share a story about something that made you sad or uncomfortable, you are a lot more likely that they will then share a story that will give you a much deeper insight into what they need from you in order to be successful. So a really good leader is a great storyteller because they tell just the right story that opens up a memory for somebody then to share their story with them. And that's what creates that deeper connection.
Okay. And next is, should we use some visual elements during our storytelling session? And
yes, if you have an opportunity to use visual cues, absolutely. Remember, I talked briefly about your image mattering when you're telling a story. So, for instance, now this is something, I don't know a lot of men that do this, but I have a tendency to pick out really cool shoes. I'm all about interesting shoes. And actually, that's one of my favorite networking tools. If I'm in a room full of people that I don't know, I'm as much as I love people, I get kind of shy sometimes. I look for somebody with interesting shoes because it's always a great conversation starter. So I actually use that sometimes. For instance, the last time I did an in-person event, I did wear cowboy boots. And I told a story about why I had these cowboy boots. We moved from Washington, D.C., which of course is a big city, to Montana 21 years ago. And it took me 20 years to buy a pair of cowboy boots. I couldn't find any I liked. I didn't think I needed them. It seemed silly for me to buy cowboy boots. But it was a great opportunity to start a story and break the ice in the conversation that I was trying to have with the audience. I could tell them that I bought these shoes after 20 years in Montana when I was visiting Wyoming, which is a different state. So it was funny. It added humor. It gave them a glimpse into who I am. Having visual cues always helps. That's why you saw pictures of my dog and those pictures in my presentation, is because it always helps to give people multiple aspects, multiple stimulants when you're telling a story. It's why you move your hands when you're speaking. It's why moving your eyebrows can change things. It's why a smile changes things. Those are all visual cues. So yes, absolutely, if you can. But try not to overdo it, because you really don't want to be distracting. I don't want to wear ruby slippers from the movie The Wizard of Oz, because that's going to distract people from my message. But I will wear something that stands out a little bit, that tells a story.
yes, so visual elements are important, right?
Absolutely. You can do it without, though. I mean, you don't need the visual elements. I still tell people, if they're going to speak in front of people and they're nervous, whether it's a first date or breaking up with somebody, giving your notice at a job or starting a new job, having to do a presentation in front of your team or in front of 100 people, wherever you are going to do that and you're feeling uncomfortable, if you start with the foundation of clothing and shoes that make you feel powerful, comfortable, and confident, it's going to help. It's really all that image and visual cues, they're all really important. So if you can't have a PowerPoint behind you or images behind you, making sure that your body language and your image are complementary to whatever you're talking about will make that difference if you don't have an opportunity to use other visuals.
Yes, yes, ma'am. And how can we deliver storytelling during our lecture time, which would help students to learn their subject very easily?
Well, think about an interdisciplinary presentation. So, for instance, if you're teaching some very detailed aspect of engineering, if you can tell a story about how that detail actually applies to something you're building or something that is going to happen with that very detailed calculation, that is going to make it much more clear. Most engineers that I know really are all about application. So if you can tell them how they're going to use this in real life, they're going to get much more out of it. And if you have a personal experience with that calculation, I'll give you an example. When I was building my own backyard patio, I put down about 500 square feet of brick pavers myself. I did it myself. We had the ground all laid out with the sand, and I was moving sand to make sure it was all level. So I got the patio done, but then I had to build stairs. And I could not figure out the calculation to build 3 steps from the patio up to the driveway. And I was so frustrated. I'm okay at math, but I could not remember the calculation rise over run. It just was, I just couldn't remember it. And what I ended up doing is I realized that I was trying to start at the footprint of the stairs and work my way up. But what I needed to do was start at the top. What does the top stair have to look like? And how high do the next 2 stairs have to be in order to get there? And how wide do they have to be? And I figured it out. So that's a clear application of the calculation of rise over run. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am. Sure, absolutely.
Good.
Yeah, and madam, you defined some values, right? So, can you demonstrate the 2 values, that is compassionate and considerate?
Compassionate and considerate. Well, absolutely. Let's think about somebody that you consider compassionate. What do they do that makes you think they're compassionate? So I'm going to go back to my friend who has a dog that picked up after her dog. She's considering the impact of what her dog just did and her behavior on the people around her. By picking up after him, she's acknowledging that she has a responsibility to limit her negative impact on the people and environment around her. The other thing that I could tell is I can tell you a story about how she always keeps treats for dogs in her pockets. Even when she's not around her dog, she always has treats for dogs. And when she sees a dog, she cannot help herself. She immediately has to go and scratch her ears. But here's where the compassionate comes in. Just last week when we were on a walk, we saw a dog that was paralyzed in its back legs. So it was using this bag that was attached to it with a harness to drag its legs so that it could move. And my friend loved this dog even more than all the other dogs she knows. And she asked all the important questions of the owner. Are you okay? How are you dealing with this? That to me demonstrates compassion. And as far as being considerate, think about the last time you got to fly on an airplane. I know it was probably a while back. The last time you flew on an airplane, it was for me. Think about when somebody's kicking the back of your seat, when you have a child behind you that's kicking the back of your seat.
Yes.
When I had small boys, when my boys were little and we would travel, and I'd be sitting next to them and one of them might kick a seat or accidentally bang on it or move things in the pocket because, they're kids, I would not say, no, don't do that, because that doesn't mean anything to a child. What I would say is, you are probably bothering the person who's sitting in that seat because they keep feeling the seat getting pushed. They keep feeling this bump against their back, and it's probably making them uncomfortable or frustrated. So I need you to be considerate of the person in front of you and give that space between the back of the seat and your feet. And every time they would stop because they realized they didn't want to make somebody upset. They didn't intentionally irritate the person in front of them. And I can tell you that wasn't always the case when I would be sitting in a seat and a little kid would be kicking my seat. And we'd hear the mother try to reason with them and say, oh, don't do that. Oh, don't do that. It wasn't about being considerate. And I had to actually turn around one time and say, if you kick the back of my seat again, I'm going to spank you. Which, of course, I couldn't. He's not my kid. I couldn't do it. But it scared him enough that he stopped kicking the back of my seat.
Yes.
But that wasn't so good for my brand. I was just really tired and annoyed. So on that note, I have to remind you that we are all human. And so, as much as I say consistently demonstrate compassion, consistently demonstrate generosity, you can do that 90% of the time. But every once in a while, you're having a really hard day and somebody needs compassion from you. If you don't have it, there is a way to handle that. You can actually tell them, I am not in that place right now. Who can I call for you? Because that is still demonstrating compassion.
Yes.
Other
Yes.
questions?
No, ma'am. All the questions we have covered, and it was absolutely fine talking with you. Sure, this webinar would help all the faculties and students to communicate through storytelling. We learned a lot today. Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us your valuable time.
Thank you so much for the honor. It was really a pleasure.
Yes, ma'am. I would like to thank you, the head of our department, Mr. Hemal Patel, sir, the HI of our institute, Professor Jatin Vaidya, sir, the academic director, Dr. Mahesh Bhatt, sir, and president of our university, Dr. Devanshu Patel, sir, for motivating and supporting us continuously. Last but not least, I would like to thank you, all the participants who assembled here today for this webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Hello, Jitin sir. No, ma'am, it's absolutely fine.
No, madam, sir. Okay, Vaishali madam.
हाँ सर, ऊपर लिखा हो.
એટલે પેલા મેડમ છે ને 11 ને 10 જોઈન થઈ 11 10 11 15 એટલે એ પ્રમાણે જોઈન કરજો.
ઓકે ઓકે સર. હા, હું 11:10 સુધી જોઈન થઈ જઈશ સર. ઓકે.
રિટેન સર. બરાબર. લિંક થઈ જશે.